All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's good to be together. Good morning to you if you're joining us on live stream or in our overflow spots today. So as Wes said, we're moving forward in our series on our values. And today the value that we're identifying is kindness. I don't know about you, but kindness doesn't really seem to be something that many people talk about much anymore, which may be the reason we ought to talk about it a little bit more. And maybe in our day, kindness would be extra helpful considering the strident difficulties in our culture. So it feels to some people perhaps kind of like a benign word, like a passive word. Like, why would kindness be part of the MO of a church and our values and how we're trying to move forward? Actually, I think if you read the Bible closely, you find that this word is quite significant, and it appears in both Old Testament and New in a variety of different ways as we begin to grasp the heart of God. So we're going to look at an account today. It's in your worship guide. This is an account about a woman whose situation is deeply and intensely personal. This is a woman who has a physical ailment, but her physical ailment has very significant social ramifications connected to it. And this is about a very private and intimate element and aspect of her life. It's the kind of thing that we carry in life that we would like it to not be known. The challenges that feel like hidden places in our lives, sometimes we feel shame, brokenheartedness over these things, and we would like to be able to get better, but we would like for people not to know about it. And that's a challenging combination, to try to get better, but to not have people know about it. And so her situation is profound. I think we would make a mistake to kind of race through the story because there are really important details in the story that add a great deal to our understanding of it. I also think we would make a mistake to reduce the breadth of the story to some kind of personal issue that we might carry personally. I mean, we all have got these things we think about. But to take the breadth, the width, the beauty of this account and shrink it down to my passionate issue, I think would be a reduction that we would regret. And then the other thing I think I would say is when we're thinking about kindness, it's a natural tendency for us to listen to all this and think about people we know who need to work on this. Like, hey, I know some people who need to get kind. They ought to hear this. But I think we know enough about life to know if each of us focuses on our own heart, that's really where we can do the real work. Our chances of whoever those people are or that person who we think are unkind getting kind because what, we're going to send them a link to this sermon is going to solve it? Probably not going to do it. We all know that we really have quite little capacity to change other people, but we can do the work in our own hearts, and if each of us do that, then maybe some beautiful things will happen. So this is a very personal experience this woman has. Because of the situation and because of the religious law and the way it frames up her situation, she's living in an isolated way, living with a certain amount of shame, rejection, ostracization, and so on. Okay, so here's how we have the account from the Gospel of Luke. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." And then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. And then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." So the way we articulate this value of kindness at Hope, we say, acting on the kindness that God has shown each of us, we strive to treat one another with generous kindness, pursuing unity and choosing sacrificial love. So our question is not, how can I get someone else to do that? Our question is, how can each of us grow in that area? All right, so let me see if I can set the stage a little bit. The context matters in the account. So Jesus has got his home base up in Capernaum. It's up on the Sea of Galilee. You've heard me mention that there's a bunch of these little fishing towns. They ring the Sea of Galilee all the way around, like Tiberias all the way up around to Bethsaida, with about half a dozen of these towns in between. The total distance isn't that much, but 2,000 years ago, without modern transportation, of course, the distances are greater than we would feel them today. But nonetheless, people knew each other in these villages, and the Sea of Galilee was their livelihood. Fishing and local agriculture was the way people made their living. And so people knew each other in these villages. And word spread in these villages, particularly word spread about Jesus. There are numerous places in the gospel accounts where this phrase, or one like it, repeats often. The news spread about him throughout that whole area. That phrase, or one like it, appears in the Gospels many times speaking about Jesus. So why did the news spread about this guy? Why was there so much scuttlebutt about this guy Jesus, and why was everybody talking about him? So first of all, apparently nobody had ever met somebody quite like him. Nobody had ever heard somebody teach quite the way he taught. The Bible tells us that he taught with a kind of authority that just seemed really different than the way everybody else taught. He seemed to have some kind of a security in his identity that enabled him to interact with people in a way that just seemed really different than the way most people did it. And why is that? I suppose because for us, most of us have insecurities and fears, and these tend to frame up the way we interact with other people, particularly if there's challenging stuff in the air or contentiousness or difficulty. We tend to arc toward our fears and insecurities, and then we tend to label people, and things tend to go south pretty quickly. It appears that Jesus had a different way about him. He didn't seem to do this kind of thing. Naturally, Jesus had occasions where he healed people. He touched them and he healed them. So, of course, that's going to spread like wildfire. And if you're a person who needed this kind of healing, and you understood that if I could get close to Jesus, perhaps this healing would be available to me, well, then, of course, you would make every effort to try to seek out that healing. So fairly early on in his ministry, when Jesus would go out in public, he would be mobbed by large crowds of people. Now, I don't know about you, but I think when we read the Bible, we tend to kind of cutify this stuff, and we tend to think, oh, big crowd of people, maybe 23 people came to Jesus. But the New Testament tells us of crowds that are numbered well in the thousands. In that day, when crowds were counted, they only counted the men. But generally speaking, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, it says they fed 5,000, but there would have been women and children there as well. Let's just do an easy guess at the math and call it 15,000 people were there. That's a lot of people. We're not talking about a little group of people who thought Jesus was sort of interesting. We're talking about throngs and throngs of thousands of people. And when Jesus was out in public, it would take no time at all for these crowds to gather in around him. And that's the kind of setting that we've got here before us. So we're told a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. Probably this was the synagogue in Capernaum. Jesus had taught there frequently. It's probable that Jesus knew Jairus, that they were friends at some level. So Jairus is going to Jesus and he's saying, look, my 12-year-old daughter is dying, and he's asking him to come heal her. Okay, so don't miss the note that Jesus is on his way doing something important when the other woman comes and touches his cloak. That gets my attention. He's interrupted by the other woman. C.S. Lewis says, of course, what most of us call interruptions, of course, actually constitute our lives. So here he is on his way to go heal Jairus' daughter, and there's thousands of people pressing around. It says the crowds almost crushed him. We're talking about an uncomfortable number of people pressing. And so then this woman comes and touches the hem of his robe. So here we have Jairus and his daughter. And Jairus is in anguish because his daughter, who was born and brought to life about 12 years ago, appears to be dying. Here we also have another woman who Jesus will call daughter, who about 12 years ago began to die. when her situation began to be apparent. Her situation of her bleeding was an intensely personal and intimate situation. There's no doubt that this would have been feminine bleeding, and it would have positioned her in a certain way in the culture. Who knows, modern medicine, perhaps she had something like endometriosis or something like that. Who knows, maybe they didn't know what she had. Maybe we wouldn't know what she had now. Okay, so we all have our limits of what we can figure out and what we can do, but nonetheless, she had been experiencing this kind of bleeding for 12 years. So about the time Jairus' little girl was born, this big girl's life began to die and shrivel because of her situation. To understand the picture just a bit more, if we look into some of the Hebrew scriptures in Leviticus 15, we read this: if a woman has a flow of blood for many days that is unrelated to her menstrual period, or if the blood continues beyond the normal period, she's ceremonially unclean. As during her menstrual period, the woman will be unclean as long as the discharge continues. Wait, did we just say that in church? Yeah, I think we did. And we ought to say stuff like that in church, because this kind of stuff, the intimacy, the privacy, the personal nature, is where so much of what's really important in life happens. And so she will be isolated. She's socially and relationally isolated. She's considered unclean. To touch her, you would have been considered unclean. It's very probable that this woman hadn't felt the tenderness of human touch in a dozen years. We don't know if she was married or if she had family or not. She's never named in the story. We don't know her name. But it's very possible that in her physical ailment and her social isolation, that she may have had to live separated from the villages and the community around her. And in the hillsides around the Sea of Galilee, there are lots of these natural caves. And a lot of people who were considered unclean lived in these caves. That separated them from where village and community and social life happened. In a kind of uniquely painful way, however, they weren't so separated that if you lived in one of these caves, you couldn't see what was happening in social and village life. These caves might have been a couple hundred yards away from the village down by the waterside. From those caves, you could have seen people gathering. You would have known when people were in the market. This woman could have seen when a group of her friends, people she had known well, were gathered. This woman would have heard the delights and the laughter of children and known that she couldn't be a part of it. She also very likely was a woman who could see when a crowd gathered. She probably had heard about Jesus. She probably had a bit of an understanding from what she was hearing about who this guy was, because everybody was talking about the fact that he heals people. And so she probably, I wonder, but I think it's probable, from her position, probably looked and thought with hopeful, eager, sad anticipation for an opportunity when maybe she could get close to Jesus. But it would require a very unique convergence of circumstances. It would require a really large crowd of people so she could hide in the flow of the crowd and be anonymous and not be discovered. Because as soon as she was identified or discovered, everybody would have identified her, said she's unclean, sent her away again. I wonder how many days did she keep an eye out on developments in the towns down beneath her view. I wonder how many times did she pray about looking for an opportunity to see if she could get close to Jesus. And so finally, this huge crowd is gathered, and it appears that this is a time that she is going to take a chance. So Jesus, on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, has this experience with her. One of the most beautiful expressions of kindness in life is when a person who is in a position of weakness is helped and cared for by a person who's in a position of strength. Now, there are lots of ways that we can care for people. We can care, of course, on sort of peer levels, but one of the most morally moving and emotional expressions of kindness is when a person who is on the high side of the equation of life is wired such to care about a person who's, let's say, on the low side of the equation of life. And they're so moved to care for this kind of person, they don't have to do it. Nothing says that they have to do it. In fact, in that day, the social construct probably more encouraged people to not interact that way. A person of strength, it was considered, could take advantage of a person of weakness, and that's just the way life goes. And if you're a person in a position of weakness, we're sorry, but it's hard luck. And so here we have Jesus, who at this moment in his life is in a position of strength. He's got tons and tons of people who are following him with all kinds of acclaim. He is a person who can touch a person and heal them. Jesus, in a very real way, was a celebrity before anybody had ever heard the phrase. If he just went out, thousands of people gathered around him and want to be close to him and seek him out. And so she is an outcast. She's downcast. She has a physical ailment, but she's also been socially ostracized. And you know that, right? These are two things that are part of what it means to be whole as a human being. It means to be physically well, and it means to be relationally well. And so she is neither physically well nor relationally well. I mean, it's one thing to be physically well but not be relationally well, and that's hard, but it's not as hard as being physically ill and relationally ill. Or if you are relationally well but physically unwell, maybe you're battling a physical illness, but you've got people around you who are loving you and encouraging you, supporting you. It helps a lot. But she has neither one. And so she's looking for an opportunity to see if she could just touch the hem of his robe. But the crowds are pressing in. Tons of people pressing. It reminded me of a time when our son Dave and I were in New York and we were going to a Yankees game. When Dave was young, he played tons of baseball. He liked the Yankees. And I grew up around New York City. So as a kid, we used to go to Yankees games and Mets games and Knicks games and Rangers games and the whole bit in New York all the time. It was what I knew as I grew up in the New York area. But our kids were born and raised in Richmond. They didn't really know anything about New York. So Dave loved the Yankees. So a couple of times we had some fun father-son outings and we went to New York to go to Yankee games, which sometimes included riding the train or the subway to get out to Yankee Stadium. Now, this is quite an experience if you're not familiar with it in New York. And because it was my first time, it was the first time for my son Dave, he was pretty mystified about how this works. So we're standing on the platform and there's thousands of people wanting to get on the train. Okay, so Dave is standing there and one train goes by, the doors open, thousands of people get on and press and get on, and he doesn't get on and the train leaves. And I said, Dave, you got to get on. And he said, well, there's so many people. It would be rude. I said, Dave, this is New York. Rudeness is suspended. So the next train comes along and people are pressing, and he's really hesitant to just step in and claim space in front of people. And I'm like, Dave, go. And he's not going. So finally I just shove him on. And I'm standing behind him, and his face is buried in the back of the guy in front of him whose shirt is all sweaty. And then he's backed up against me, and he looks up at me like this. And I'm like, we're in New York, bud. So it reminds me of this kind of a throng of people who are all pressed against each other. And so this woman reaches out to touch him. I don't know all the details. Some of it's conjecture. But the way she's doing this is remarkably selfless. You see, she knows if he touches her, then he's going to be unclean. The way she tries to touch him to receive his healing also is protecting him from touching her, because he could not be accused of having touched her. She did all the reaching and the touching, and she didn't even touch his body. She just wanted to touch the hem of his long shirt. She figured if his shirt is touching his body, then maybe I can receive this healing. So now, around the Sea of Galilee, among other things, there are some churches that commemorate and mark some of these places. There's a Catholic church in the town of Magdala, where Mary Magdalene is from, and there's a painting on the wall of this Catholic church. And it's a painting of this woman reaching out to touch Jesus' robe. Okay, so you can see the table there. That's the altar in the church. The painting is big, and it's all behind it. We've got one that's a little bit closer up, and this gets you into the action. Part of the power of the painting is it's this big, huge painting, but there is nothing higher than knee height in the entire painting. The artist is clearly expressing the lowly condition of this woman, because everything's happening down at knee level and lower, with feet and sandals, and her down low trying to reach to him. Her down low because of her physical and social condition. Her down low bringing together a combination of hope and desperation. And some of you have been in times in life where those two elements make for the recipe of your emotional state. And hope and desperation bring her to reach out and think, if I can just touch his robe, perhaps I can be healed. Her faith is beautiful, but it's rather incomplete. And in that regard, many of us are like her. Perhaps our faith is beautiful in its desire and its trust and its hope that we can receive this healing from Jesus, but she wants an anonymous healing, which is completely understandable if you're her. She doesn't want to be outed. She wants to get the healing and get out of the crowd so she can have the restoration of her physical health. A little bit of research tells me that endometriosis is a very painful condition, if that's indeed what she had. She's desperate. She spent all her money. The other gospels say that she went to all the doctors and spent all her money, but none of them could help her. Okay, fine. We all have limits. It's interesting that Luke, who's a doctor, omits that line, that she spent all her money and went to all the doctors and none of them could help her. And so her faith is beautiful, but it's incomplete because she wants Jesus' healing, but she's not anticipating any kind of personal relationship with him. But the heart of Jesus means that if we want the healing we're looking for, it won't happen anonymously. He will always be reaching to us so that there's this personal, life-giving, and intimate relationship with him. So in her faith, she's thinking, if I can just touch him, he'll never know. He'll never know. I can get healed. I can disappear in the crowd, and physically I'll be well. The problem is, if this isn't identified publicly, she will remain ostracized in her unclean condition until she effectively proves publicly that she no longer has a situation. Theoretically, she would go to a doctor who would then acknowledge that. So she reaches out to touch the hem of his robe. Her faith is reaching for him. It's not personally invested in him. It's that she just wants to get well. And who of us wouldn't understand that? Dale Bruner, a commentator, writes, in the gospel, faith is never general belief in the existence of God. Instead, it is getting in touch with Jesus by bringing one's major need to him with the expectation that Jesus can do miracles with it. I love that quote, and I don't like it, because like you, I have the question, then why doesn't he do the miracles all the time for everybody who's in need? And the answer, of course, is we don't know. And so she reaches out to touch the hem of his robe. She'll protect him from touching her. She just wants to touch him. So notice what happens in verse 40, in the 44-45 section. Jesus says, who touched me? It says the crowds almost crushed him, and Peter says to him essentially, Jesus, there's hundreds of people around. I bet you 20 people touched you in the last 30 seconds. But that's not what Peter said. Peter said, they're pressing against you. Note the distinction of Jesus using the word touched and the others using the word pressed or crowded. To Jesus, there is something very distinctly different about being essentially bumping into each other or somebody who is reaching out to touch me. Bumping into him may not have any kind of faith or spiritual expression in it at all. But her reaching out to touch him is a beautiful articulation of her hope, and that she's reaching out for him with that hope. So he says, who touched me? When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus insisted. He said, somebody touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. I have no idea. Like, what? What did that feel like? What would that feel like? What does he mean when he says, I know that power went out from me? I don't think we know. Then the woman, note these phrases, seeing that she could not go unnoticed. She clearly was trying really hard to go unnoticed. She clearly was trying to bring the depth of the intimate, personal, private pain and shame unnoticed to get her healing and be able to depart anonymously in the crowd. But seeing that she couldn't go unnoticed, she came trembling and she fell at his feet. Trembling, she fell at his feet. Why? She's going to be outed. She's going to be stood up in front of everybody. And then notice the power and the intimacy of the next sentence. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him. She is confessing and speaking the reality of the intimate, personal, shameful situation that she's in. And it's an essential part of the story, inextricably linked to the completeness of her healing. We won't find that full healing we're hungry for as long as we're keeping it all private and under wraps. Yeah, but we're so afraid of what the exposure will bring. We get that. But the kindness of God and the grace of Christ bring us to the fullness of healing, which requires the full exposure. And then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Daughter, he says to her. Not outcast, not unclean, not bleeder. Daughter. Woman is the highest she would have ever allowed herself to hope for. He goes higher than that. And he looks at her and he calls her daughter. Don't miss, the whole account opened with a man who loved his daughter. She's 12 years old. She was given life 12 years ago and she's dying. And here Jesus Christ is making this woman who had been a complete outcast, daughter, who lost her life 12 years ago. And she's going to be born again in this experience with him. So in Mark 5, it says, immediately the bleeding stopped. She could feel in her body that she'd been healed of her terrible condition. I don't know what that would have felt like, but she clearly felt it. Healed of her terrible condition. So Jesus is interacting with this woman in a remarkably tender way. She's never heard anyone call her daughter in decades. Maybe if she had a father who was remarkably loving and tender, she remembers the voice of her own father calling her daughter. Maybe, maybe not. But here she comes with the full, honest transparency of the shame and the personal, intimate nature of her need. And she brings all of that yielded to Jesus. And the result is her healing and her restoration as a human being called daughter. You see, Jesus will call her now and expose her fully so that everyone will know she's healed, because the wholeness that we're all hungry for is a physical and a relational wholeness. And Jesus will restore on both counts when she didn't even have the second part on her mind. So, what would it take for us to become more kind? Frankly, first of all, it would take a desire to become more kind. If you don't want to become more kind, then drop it. Go home and forget about it today. First of all, it would take a desire to become more kind. All right, ready? Next, it'll take no labels, no categories. Any category or label that we use for any group of people will stifle the flow of the heart of God through us. It will also stifle the intimacy of our relationship with God. We are prone to labels. We all get this, right? Let's not act like that's a big surprise. We're all prone to this because we're fearful and insecure. And so somebody who we see as being on the other side, we feel as a threat and a fear. And so we label them because it somehow makes us feel more righteous, and we don't have to keep entering the complexities, the gripping complexities of what it means to be a human being. But Jesus would not label people. There's one category for human beings for Jesus: human beings. I get it. We have them. Okay, but anytime we do this, just to go ahead and put my hand in the hornet's nest, If you are calling them those right-wing Trump people, if you're calling them those left-wing socialists, if you're calling them those homophobes or those weird gay people, all of those labels will stifle the gospel in our lives. All of those labels will do that. We do it because we're human. We do it because we're fearful and insecure. Jesus was so different. Nobody had ever seen somebody like him. He just doesn't operate the way human beings normally operate. How could that be? Somehow his identity was so secure. His insecurities not present like ours. His sense of identity was founded on something more than all the tumult around. For some of us, we're like, man, that's just too hard to do that. We can try. For Jesus, he had no categories for people, which meant there was no categories for him, which meant he didn't fit anybody's categories, which is the Son of God come into the world to give life. And the way he did it is breathtaking in its interaction of giving dignity to human beings and upholding God's intended design for human life. That's challenging. He never seemed to forfeit either one of those. Let's pray. Our Father God in heaven, maybe the best thing to pray 100 times over is, would you please help us? Would you please help us find the security in your love that we could care about human beings, people like us and people not like us, that we could care about human beings because we all are human beings. Jesus, would you help us grow into this place of kindness when we see the breathtaking tenderness of your love? Would you help us to grow into this with you? We pray this in your name. Amen.
I'd invite you to stand. We're going to close by singing together. Before we